May butang kanyang tanan. Magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat. Fiyo, gufuan mo ba kong nagluhanan?
Gufuan.
Wow. At least there's a group here that could understand that greetings. But I'm sure the others don't. But that's a simple Tuduray way of greeting you. Good morning. Because I belong to the Tuduray tribe of the province of Maguindanao, particularly in the municipality of Upi and South Upi, where the Tuduray are predominant. We are fortunately or unfortunately within the autonomous region in Muslim. I don't know what's running in your mind. Okay, as a little backgrounder, as an IP stance fighter and defender of the rights, when I was in Congress, I was able to principally author the Republic Act 8371, which is the IPRA, Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act. That law is supposed to be the Bible of the protection of the rights of indigenous peoples over their ancestral domain, including education. But the trouble now is that the NCIP is there because of lack of funds, and that there was no clear-cut political will by previous administration to seriously implement the law. So, as if the NCIP is just not enough in the exercise of their function. But nevertheless, I'm very, very thankful to the President, President Rodrigo Duterte, that in his administration, I was the second appointee in the Commission on Higher Education, representing the indigenous people. So I'm very, very thankful for that. So I cannot allow things not to prosper as far as empowering the indigenous peoples during my stint, particularly on education. This is an opportune time wherein we can put forward our advocacy on education as far as the indigenous peoples is concerned. Otherwise, I feel guilty later on if I cannot do anything about it. So this is the challenge that I'm facing. So, by the way, as a commissioner of the Commission on Higher Education, I have five advocacies. Number one is, of course, walang pabor-pabor, indigenous people studies or education. Okay, and number two is about federalism. And number three, peace and development. That's closest to my heart because my background orientation is really on peace and development. And fourth one is on agriculture. Now, we are supposed to be an agricultural country, and yet it's so ironic that we're even sending our students abroad to know more about agricultural technologies. Like, for example, the agro studies, we are sending our students to Israel. Israel is supposed to be a desert country, and that we are sending them to learn about agriculture. So when I was there, I told them, why are you here? You are not supposed to be here. You are supposed to be in the Philippines, and the people of Israel should come to the Philippines and learn about agricultural technology. But it's the other way around. But that's the reality nowadays. So we have to live by it. So we have to do something about agriculture if we expect sufficiency on food by every Filipino. And last but not least is good governance. Okay, so of course this is in consonance with the flagship program of the administration. Good governance, that means we have to promote the eradication of graft and corruption, criminality, etc., etc. So I have been pushing for this. But this time around, I will concentrate on areas on education as well as right to self-determination of the indigenous peoples. Now, in this particular occasion, you have this theme, empowering indigenous peoples through higher education. And if you look at the backdrop, we have here mainstreaming indigenous peoples education, research and extension service in higher education to empower IP communities. But I'm sorry, I forgot. Before I proceed, may I also acknowledge our guests in the presidential table. I was so excited, so dire-diretso ako without even acknowledging them. Of course, I'm so happy that my sparring partner in the commission, also from Mindanao, is with us now, Commissioner Pek Aliden. Palakpakan po natin si Pek. He's also a champion of IP rights. Tinan mo, siya yung nag-umpisa ng pamulaan school dyan sa USEF. So, later on, I'll deal with that because ang nangyayari ngayon, there's no clear-cut policy on education wherein it will be applied across schools throughout the country. So that's what we are looking forward to. And I hope this platform, this summit can do something about that. Of course, we have also the regional director, very active, Director Raul Alvarez. He is not from Mindanao, he is from the Visayas, but with the heart of a Mindanao. If you notice, most of these schools under him are schools that are compliant of the PSGs of CHED, policy, standard, and guidelines of CHED. So, very, very effective regional director. Of course, nandiyan din yung ating director ng OPKRM, na walang iba kundi si Nelson Kainhu. Bago lang si Nelson, is also a Bisaya, I think from Bohol. But I know he can do a lot in the Commission on Higher Education, particularly in the area of research and extension. Nandito rin si Dr. Castor of OPKRM. We were together in the first summit in Baguio because basically this second IP summit that we are having now. Si Ronald is over there, my tukayo. They are behind the camera in this IP summit that we are conducting. And of course, Dr. Amar Torres, Executive Director of the Philippine Social Science Center sa UP. Okay? May continue? Okay. No first IP summit in Baguio, our team was runs this way: a strategic conversation on empowerment of IP communities through education and self-determination. I will notice this one today is that you are saying empowering indigenous peoples through higher education. Of course, with this expanded version, but I would now also include aspect not only on empowering IPs through education, but also on self-determination. Okay, I'll explain later why I'm including that. Okay, what is the coverage that I would like to share with you as far as this summit is concerned? Of course, when you speak of IP empowerment, we are talking about education. Now, education, we have to make a distinction here, because when we talk of education, number one, we are talking of the general concept of education, wherein everybody should be educated to be able to be empowered, to learn, to develop your skills, expertise, etc., to widen your horizon so that you become productive and effective, competitive, not only locally but also internationally. That is the common perception of education. Okay? But the education that I would like to put forward as a matter of output of this summit is that education that has something to do with learning about the advocacies, the rights, the culture of the indigenous peoples. I'll explain on that later on. Okay? And the second one is on self-determination. When I speak about self-determination, I think this is very, very important because nowadays we're talking about amending the Constitution of the Philippine Republic. So it's about time that the IP can also put forward the aspiration on self-determination. So, and that if we can achieve education, self-determination, the net amount or result of that is you will be able to attain peace and development. So that is the highest aspiration that the indigenous peoples could have, peace and development, just like any other human being for that matter. Now, what is the purpose and objectives that the summit is supposed to undertake? Okay, number one, on education and IP studies, letter A. Okay, take note of this. To study history, culture, identity, advocacy, rights of IPs will serve as a moral booster to do more in their share in nation building. Okay, anong perception sa IP? Usually, sinasabi natin IP, bakit natin pakikialaman yan? They are political reject, etc. But this time around, by trying to study about the advocacy, the rights of IP, this can be a moral booster for IPs to do more in their share in nation building. Para naman kayo medyo magkaroon ng pride, inspiration, na pinag-aaralan din pala ang kabutihan ng inyong kultura at inyong advocacy at ang inyong mga karapatan. So, letter B, it will educate, take note, it will educate the mainstream society about the significance of history, culture, identity, advocacy, and rights of IPs as important segment of Philippine society. Hence, shall eliminate stereotyping against them and live in peaceful coexistence with other people. Okay, so there are two things here. Moral booster for the IPs themselves, meaning if you study about the culture, rights, advocacies of IPs, it will serve as a moral booster for IPs to do more in nation building, and at the same time, we are educating the mainstream society in order that they would understand that the IPs are important segment of Philippine society and therefore stereotyping against them can be eliminated, because the usual tendency is that, IP, wala naman may bibigay na kabutihan yan. You are a political reject, mangmang, and you don't have place in society. Kaya hindi kayo priority. Basically because mainstream society are not educated about the importance and the significance of the culture, the advocacies, the rights of indigenous peoples. If you go deeper into history, who are supposed to be the first Filipinos? It's the indigenous peoples. And for that matter, we can even consider the unique ways of life, way of life, culture of indigenous peoples as bedrock and foundation of the entire Filipino culture. And we have to be proud about that. That's why I'm so proud being an IP. I am a stakeholder of this country. We should share that kind of feeling to eliminate inferiority complex amongst us. So what is supposed to be the output that we are expecting out of this summit? First, of course, my intention really is after this conversation, this sharing of insights, then this could serve as a preparation for the integration into the curriculum of indigenous people's education. That is my aspiration. We can at least, as much as possible, devise a module in preparation for the integration of IP education into the curriculum. And CHED, as a policy-making body, can come up with a policy for the integration of IP studies into the curriculum, and therefore it can be applied across throughout the country, particularly to those state universities and colleges that are catering to predominantly IP areas, like that of those in Mindanao, Davao, Cotabato, Agusan, Arm, etc., etc. So all of those universities, higher educational institutions in this part of the country should be mandated to teach indigenous people studies or education, so that IPs will be educated also about their culture, their advocacy, and that they feel proud about themselves, and that the mainstream society at the same time would also be informed and enlightened about the significance of this culture of the indigenous peoples, so that again, stereotyping against them would be eliminated. Now, Director Kainho was mentioning about the legal basis for coming up with this idea of indigenous people studies. Of course, we have the Philippine Constitution. Article 2, Section 22 of the Philippine Constitution states that the state recognizes and promotes the rights of indigenous cultural communities within the framework of national unity and development. So this is one of the legal bases wherein I thought of coming up with this idea. And of course, mayroon tayong Republic Act 8371, which is the IPRA law. I made mention about that earlier on as a basis. And third is the UNRIP. UNRIP is the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So the UNRIP protects the rights of IPs, including that of education, access to education. Okay, so these are the legal basis. And another law, which is not so popular because this law in the first place were never signed or was never signed into law by President Aquino, Noynoy Aquino. Maybe he was not interested of it, or maybe he was busy playing Dota at the time. But how was this law turned out to be a law? Because after 40 days, if a law is not being signed by the President, it matures into a law. So this law matured into a law after 40 days of even if the President did not sign it. So what does the law say? Republic Act 10908 state that an act mandating the integration of Filipino Muslim and indigenous people's history, culture, and identity in the study of Philippine history in both basic and higher education. Nowadays, DepEd has a program on this already. They are pushing forward basic education along this line. On higher education, some state universities are doing it, but there is no clear-cut policy of JED that are really mandating all the SUCs around the country to implement IP education or studying the history and the culture, identity of indigenous peoples. So in section 2, it states that integration of Filipino Muslim and indigenous peoples' history, culture, and identity studies in Philippine history, with the ultimate objective of creating an inclusive history that accounts for all Filipinos. There is a need to integrate history, culture, identity studies of Filipino Muslims, indigenous peoples in the grand narrative of Philippine history. So it's very clear, but we are not doing this. If we are doing it, it's only through the personal advocacy of some school officials for that matter, but there's no policy to that effect. So this is, hopefully we can do this by way of integrating into the curriculum. Okay, number 2, I was talking also about self-determination. So I have to include this. Take a look. Okay, self-determination, we have what we call the establishment of IP federal states. Yan ang isa sa advocacy ng mga IP ngayon. Federal state. But if a federal state is not possible because you've got to have the 4 elements of a federal state before it can be, or a place, before it can be converted into a federal state, you have to meet the 4 requirements. Number 1, you have territory. Number 2, you have people. Number 3, you have government. And number 4, you have economic viability. Of course, the IPs have government of their own, the traditional one. We have their people, their territory. The trouble is, I doubt it, if they can fulfill the last requirement, which is economic viability. So, what is the solution to that? Kung hindi talaga pwede ang federal state. Number 2 states that to establish IP sub-states, autonomous territories. Now, I will share with you the experience of Canada later on. I show the map. Kung hindi pwede ang federal states, then autonomous territory or sub-states can be possible. But this has to be incorporated into the Constitution of the Republic of the Philippines. Letter C, to be able to exercise right to self-determination, self-governance. Yun na nga. Before you can even exercise your right to self-determination or practice your culture, you've got to have a territory. You have to have a state or autonomous territory for that matter. Letter D, to attain peace and development. If we have this, of course, peace and development will follow. Letter E, okay, take note. This is new. The Bagani was mentioned a while ago.
Yes.
It was used by ABS-CBN through their teleserye entitled Bagani, but to my mind and to the minds of leaders, particularly those of Mindanao, the word Bagani is endemic, something sacred to the indigenous peoples because it's part of their history. If you go back to history, the Baganis, the Alangkat, these were the people who fought side by side with the Muslim warriors in defense of Mindanao against the colonizers. Okay, so fortunately, we were able to convince ABS-CBN to recognize the significance of the word Bagani to the indigenous peoples. Rituals were done. They accepted the terms that we have communicated to them. If you observe, they changed their disclaimer recognizing the presence of the indigenous peoples. Now, this time around, another advocacy that we have to fight. If you listen to radios and TVs, Senator Gordon made mention about his bill. His bill has proposed for the additional of the 9 ray of the sun in favor of the Muslims, because accordingly the Muslims fought against the colonizers. So what is my proposition? What is my advocacy on this? Letter E, to be given a share in the representation, recognition, and honor relative to the proposed additional of 9th ray of the sun in the Philippine flag in favor of the Muslims, or better yet, a 10th ray is more appropriate for the indigenous peoples. Okay, 2 things. Of course, that proposition is a welcome development as far as Muslims, including the IPs, are concerned. Adding the 9th ray in the flag, in the flag. What we're saying is that baka pwede naman the IP could also have a share in the representation, the honor, in that 9th ray. Pero, to my honest belief, a 10th ray for the indigenous peoples is more appropriate. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Kung agree kayo, mayroon akong draft resolution dyan. I know you are IP leaders, advocates, stakeholders, and you have to join with us in this advocacy. So, nakikiusap ako sa inyo. Okay? Mayroon tayong draft resolution dyan. Kung gusto ninyo mamaya, you can affix your signature. And we'll send it to Congress, to Senator Gordon and that of the lower house. Can we do that later?
Yes, sir.
Yes?
Yes, sir.
Very good, very good. Pwede na tayo umuwi. No. This is a 2-day affair. Okay? Now, okay, speaking of federalism, look at the map of Canada. We have to learn from this as a model. Canada has 10 federal states which they call provinces. Mayroon silang British Columbia, Alberta, and the other ones, very hard to read, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, and all of them 10. And on top of the map, we have Yukon, Northwest Territories, Nunavut. These are the autonomous territories of the indigenous peoples, the Inuits. Okay? They have the regular federal states below, 10 of them, and on top, they have the autonomous territories for the indigenous peoples with almost the same privileges that are given to the regular federal states. You see, political representation, economic opportunities, binibigyan sila. If they can do it, we can also do that in the Philippines. Why not? Of course, yes. We have to aspire for that. We have to go to Congress and tell the framers of the Constitution na dapat respetuhin naman yung right to self-determination ng mga indigenous peoples. Okay, next. Ito, ito sample ha. Huwag masaktan yung ibang IP. Bakit ganyan lang ang itsura? If you look at the proposed federal states of Mindanao as proposed by Senator Nene Pimentel, we have the Northern Mindanao Federal State, the Federal State, Basulta Federal State, we have the Maranao, Maguindanao, Iranon Federal States, mayroon tayong Eastern Mindanao Federal State, mayroong Central Mindanao Federal State, and if you see that little yellow colored map there is the Mamalo Autonomous Territory. That is just a sample. And we can even create other autonomous territories for other indigenous peoples group in Mindanao. Maybe the Talandig, maybe the Mangyans, the Mansaka. For as long as you can delineate your area, then I think you are qualified to become an